The smell of pine resin and cold mud was the first thing Jane noticed when the stagecoach lurched to a stop outside Harland Creek. Not the mountains pressing down from the north, not the cluster of weathered buildings huddled against a gray October sky, just that sharp, living smell of resin and earth, as if the land itself were breathing through its teeth. She pressed her nose to the cracked leather curtain and breathed it in. It was nothing like Abilene. It was nothing like anywhere she had ever been. That was, she supposed, precisely the point. She had $3.40 folded inside her left boot. She had a carpet bag containing 2 dresses, a hairbrush, a Bible with a cracked spine, and a tintype photograph tucked between the pages of the Gospel of John. She had an advertisement clipped from the Western Recorder, now soft at the folds from so much handling. Widowed rancher, Harland Creek, Idaho Territory. Child in care, seeks able woman, marriage or fair wage arrangement, honest work, decent home. Write to H. Callaway, general delivery. She had written, he had replied. The reply had been 9 words. Come if you're willing. Work is real. So am I. 9 words were, she had decided, enough. The stage driver set her bag in the mud without ceremony and climbed back to his bench. Jane stood on the single plank that served as the town's boardwalk and looked down the length of Harland Creek's main street. A dry goods store, a livery, a church with a crooked bell tower, a land office with a padlocked door, 2 horses at a rail, patient as old men, a woman in a heavy coat who glanced at Jane, then glanced away. No one was holding a sign. No one stepped forward. Jane picked up her carpet bag, squared her shoulders, and walked toward the dry goods store because it was the only building with a lamp burning in the window, and because light, she had always believed, was worth walking toward regardless of what waited on the other side of it. The bell above the door announced her. A stout man behind the counter looked up from a ledger. She said, before he could speak, "I'm looking for Henry Callaway." The man's expression shifted, not unkind, but weighted with something she couldn't yet name. He set his pencil down. "You'd be the woman who answered his notice," he said. "I would." He nodded, slow as a door swinging shut. "He'll be along directly. His little girl had a fever this morning. Kept him home." Jane set her bag on the floor and folded her hands and waited. Outside, the October wind pressed against the glass. Inside, the lamp held steady. Henry Callaway arrived 23 minutes later. Jane knew because she counted. He came through the door trailing cold air and wood shavings, a man of perhaps 35 with a jaw that looked like it had been squared off with a carpenter's plane, and eyes the particular dark gray of sky just before serious weather. He was not tall, but he was solid, built the way fence posts are built, not for elegance but for standing. He carried his hat in his left hand and a child against his right shoulder, a little girl of perhaps 4 years, wrapped in a quilt, pieced from feed sack cloth and sleeping, with her cheek pressed flat against his neck. Henry Callaway looked at Jane across the dry goods counter, the way a man looks at a contract he is not certain he can afford to sign. "Miss Whitfield," he said. It was not a question. "Mr. Callaway," she said. He shifted the child slightly, careful not to wake her. "She ran a temperature since last night. I didn't want to leave her with a neighbor." "Of course not," Jane said. And then, because she had never been a woman who wasted time on preamble, "What's her name?" Something moved in those gray eyes, briefly, like light crossing water. "Clara," he said. "Her name is Clara." Jane looked at the sleeping child, the fine dark hair damp at the temples, the small mouth slightly open, one fist curled against the quilt, and she felt something shift inside her chest, quiet and irrevocable, like the sound a lock makes when the right key finally finds its way home. "I will raise her as my own," Jane said. "Not as a proposal, not as a performance for the storekeeper who was very clearly listening. She said it the way you say a thing when it is already decided. Whatever arrangement we settle on, that's what I'll do." Henry Callaway looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Come and see the place first. You might change your mind." "I won't," she said. "You haven't seen it yet," he said. "No," Jane agreed, "but I've seen her." The storekeeper found something urgent to do in the back room. The lamp burned on. Clara slept. The Callaway homestead sat 4 miles northeast of Harland Creek, at the end of a rutted track that the recent rains had turned to brown porridge. Henry drove the buckboard with one hand, holding Clara in his lap with the other, and the little girl woke somewhere on the 2nd mile and regarded Jane from across her father's arm, with eyes that were gray like his but rounder, still soft with sleep and fever. Jane did not reach for her. She understood, the way you understand certain things about weather and animals and grieving people, that trust is not a thing you can hurry. "What's that?" Clara asked, pointing at Jane's carpet bag. "Everything I own," Jane said. Clara considered this with the gravity of a judge. "Is it heavy?" "Not very." "Papa's saddle is heavy," Clara offered, as though this were useful information. "I expect it is," Jane said. Henry said nothing, but Jane noticed that the line of his shoulders had loosened, just slightly, since they'd left the store. The homestead declared itself through the tree line, a 2-room cabin with a stone chimney, a barn that needed new siding on its north face, a kitchen garden that had been put to bed for winter but tidily, the rows marked with small stakes. Someone had cared for this land. Someone had taken time with it even in sorrow. Henry helped Clara down from the buckboard first, and then stood aside while Jane climbed down herself, which she did without difficulty or comment. Inside, the cabin was cold. The fire had been banked low, and spare in the way of a place managed by someone who had more work than ours. A table, 2 chairs, a cook stove, a rope bed behind a curtain for Clara, a larger bed against the far wall, a shelf holding 3 books and a tin of coffee. On the table, a second tin cup beside the first, as though set there by habit or by hope. Jane put her carpet bag down and began rebuilding the fire without asking permission. She had the kindling going before Henry had finished hanging his coat. "You don't have to," he began. "I know," she said. "Where's your flour?" "Larder, left side." He paused. "You're not going to look at the rest of the place first. The fire needed building. I'll look presently." She found the flour, the lard, the salt. Clara should have hot food. Fever or no, she needs to eat. Henry stood in the middle of his own kitchen and watched a stranger in a gray wool dress take command of his cook stove, and he did not say a single word. Clara tugged his hand and he lifted her up and held her and watched Jane work, and the cabin filled slowly with the smell of wood smoke and then with the smell of biscuits, which is a smell that is very nearly indistinguishable from the smell of being taken care of. That was the first evening. The arrangement they settled on was spoken plainly, sitting across the table from each other after Clara had been put to bed. Jane laid it out the way you lay out terms at a livestock auction, clearly, without sentiment, so that no one could later claim they hadn't understood. She would keep house, tend the kitchen garden come spring, and help with whatever work her hands were fit for. Henry would provide her board, a small wage, and a room, which, given that the cabin had only 2 rooms, meant the curtained alcove where Clara slept, and a cot moved in beside the child's rope bed. It was not, Jane noted privately, a marriage arrangement. Not yet, but she did not say this aloud. Henry listened to all of it. Then he said, "That's fair." "There's one more thing," Jane said. "All right. Clara, I want to understand what she needs. Not just food and warmth, what she was before." Henry's hands, flat on the table, went very still. "Her mother died 14 months ago. Fever, same as what Clara has today, only worse." He said it plainly, the way a man says a plain and terrible thing that he has already survived but not yet finished surviving. "Her name was Ruth. She was a good woman. Clara has her eyes." Jane did not offer sympathy. She had learned that some grief doesn't want sympathy. It wants witness. She simply held his gaze, and let the words settle in the room. She asked about her? Jane said. Every few days I tell her the truth, that her mama is in heaven and loves her from there. Good, Jane said. Don't stop telling her that. Henry looked at her steadily. You have children of your own? No, a beat. I was engaged once. He died of a riding accident before we were married, 6 years ago now. Something in Henry's expression shifted, not pity but recognition, the particular recognition of one person who has learned to carry absence to another. I'm sorry, he said. So am I, she said. But here we are. She rose and washed the biscuit tin in the basin. Henry banked the fire for the night. They moved around each other in the small kitchen, with the careful courtesy of two people who are, against all reasonable expectation, beginning to trust each other. Outside, the wind came down from the mountains and pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the fire held. The fever broke on the third day. Clara sat up in her rope bed at dawn, eyes bright, and announced that she was hungry and that her feet were cold. In that order. Jane put wool socks on the small cold feet and set a bowl of porridge in small hands and sat on the edge of the cot and watched the child eat with the single-minded efficiency of the recovering, and she thought, yes, this is right, this is exactly right. In the days that followed, a rhythm began to build itself from the raw material of necessity. Jane rose before Henry and had the stove going by the time he came in from morning chores. She learned where things were, the good knife, the extra lamp oil, the wooden box under the bed where Henry kept his accounts, and, she noticed, a folded paper that bore a woman's handwriting. She did not touch the paper. Clara followed Jane like a small, determined shadow through the daily work. She stirred the porridge and said it was helping. She handed Jane clothespins at the line and called each one by a different name. She asked, on the 5th morning, whether Jane was going to stay. Jane stopped with a clothespin in her hand. The October air was cold against her face, and the clean smell of wet linen was all around her. Would you like me to? She asked. Clara squinted up at her with those gray eyes. Papa made a second chair, she said. He made it before you came. I think he was hoping. Jane looked back at the cabin's open door. Through it, in the dim interior, she could just make out the shape of the second chair pulled up to the table. She had thought it was simply the spare. She saw, now, that it was newer than the first, the wood still pale, the joints cleaner, made by someone who was, in fact, hoping. She hung the last shirt on the line and did not let Clara see her face for a moment. It was a small thing, but on the frontier, small things are the only honest currency. November came in hard, which was its habit in the Idaho Territory. The mountains drew their white curtains across the upper ridges, and the cold came down the valley like something with intention. Jane and Henry began the work of winterizing the homestead, banking the foundation, caulking the window frames, laying in the last of the wood, and in the working, the strangeness between them eased by degrees. You cannot hand someone a caulking iron and argue over the angle of the bead and remain strangers. You cannot split wood side by side for 3 hours in the bitter cold and maintain the formal distance of an arrangement. He told her things, out there in the cold. Small things at first, that the north pasture fence had been the bane of his existence for 2 years, that the roan mare preferred apples to any other thing on earth, that Clara had named every chicken individually and would weep if she ever learned what chickens were ultimately for. Then larger things, that he had come to Harland Creek from Missouri with Ruth 7 years ago when the farmland east was being eaten by the railroads and the rents, that he had built the cabin with his own hands over one brutal winter before the barn, sleeping in a lean-to beside the foundation, that the first year had nearly broken him, but Ruth had kept her nerve when his had failed, and he had not yet, even now, forgiven himself for surviving her. Jane listened, she said, when he fell quiet. Surviving isn't a thing that needs forgiving. He looked at her sidelong, the axe handle resting across his knee. Feels like it does sometimes. I know, she said. It doesn't. He held her gaze a moment longer than he meant to. Then he went back to splitting wood, and neither of them spoke again for a while, and the silence between them was, for the first time, entirely comfortable. Henry came home from the land office on the third Friday of November, and his jaw was set in that way Jane had already learned to read. Not anger precisely, but controlled trouble. He washed his hands at the basin and didn't speak until Clara was in bed. Then he sat down and said, "Holt is moving on the south pasture." Jane knew the name. Everyone in Harland Creek knew the name. Denton Holt ran the largest cattle operation in the valley and had spent the better part of 3 years acquiring the smaller homesteads that bordered his range, sometimes through purchase, sometimes through means that were technically legal and entirely without conscience. He had twice sent riders to the Callaway homestead to inquire whether Henry was interested in selling. Henry had twice said no. "What's he doing?" Jane asked. "Claiming a water right dispute. Says the creek that feeds my south pasture originates on his land, and he intends to file for primary rights at the territorial office in Boise." Henry set his hands flat on the table. "If he gets it, I lose the winter water source for the cattle. The south herd can't survive on the North Creek alone. I'd have to sell down to a herd too small to carry the ranch." Jane was quiet for a moment. "Is the claim legitimate?" "His lawyer says so. Mine says no, which means a judge in Boise will decide, eventually, and Holt has more patience and more money than I do." He looked up. "I'm sorry. This isn't your problem. You came here for an honest arrangement, and I didn't say anything about a legal fight." Jane folded her hands on the table. "I came here," she said precisely, "to this homestead. The homestead includes the south pasture and the creek." A pause. "I have some money. Not much, but I have it. I'm not taking your money. I'm not offering it as charity. I'm saying there may be options." She met his eyes steadily. "Have you spoken to anyone else on the creek? Anyone else Holt has his eye on?" Henry was very still. "Garrett Voss, 2 miles south. Holt approached him last spring." "Then go talk to Garrett Voss," Jane said. "2 homesteaders filing a joint objection carry more weight than one. A territorial judge notices when it isn't one man against a cattle baron, when it's a community." Henry stared at her. Not with surprise exactly, more with the expression of a man who has been walking in the dark and has just heard someone strike a match. "You've done this before," he said. "My father fought a railroad easement in Kansas for 4 years," she said. "He lost, but I watched how it worked." Henry's jaw was still set, but the trouble in it had shifted. It was no longer the trouble of a man facing something alone. He left for Garrett Voss's place the next morning. He came back with Voss's word that he'd sign any joint filing Henry's lawyer prepared. He came back also with the particular expression of a man who has started to understand that the woman in his kitchen is not simply an able pair of hands. Clara was at the table drawing horses with a stub of charcoal when he came in, and she looked up and said, "Did Jane help you?" Henry hung his hat on its peg. "She did," he said. Clara went back to her horses. "I told you she would," she said, as though this had never been in question. December arrived, and with it a cold so clean and profound that it seemed to have weight, to press down on the rooftop and the barn and the bare-branched trees with deliberate, personal force. The creek near the south pasture froze at the edges, but kept its center running, which was what mattered. The joint filing had been submitted to the territorial office, and Holt's riders had not returned since Henry and Voss had delivered their response in writing. The battle was not over, but it had been checked, and checking a bully, Jane had learned from her father, was sometimes enough to buy you the time you needed. Inside the cabin, December brought its own weather. It happened on a Wednesday evening, which is, by any honest account, a plain sort of day on which to have the architecture of your understanding altered. Clara had been put to bed, and Jane was mending a tear in Henry's work shirt by the lamp, the needle pulling through the heavy cloth with small, steady sounds, and Henry was reading, or appearing to read, his eyes on the page but still in a way that did not suggest reading. The fire snapped. Outside, the wind moved through the pine tops and made a sound like breathing. Henry said, without looking up, "I found the photograph." Jane did not stop her needle. "Which one?" she said, though she knew. There was only one photograph in her Bible. "It fell out when Clara was looking at your book. She asked me who the woman was." Jane set the shirt down in her lap. "What did you tell her?" "I told her I didn't know, that she should ask you." He looked up then. The lamplight made the gray of his eyes warmer than usual, or perhaps she was simply learning to read them better. "Who is she?" Jane was quiet for a moment, not from reluctance, from the need to say it correctly, the way you need to say certain things correctly, so that they land the way they are meant to land. "Her name was Margaret Whitfield," she said. "My older sister. She died of cholera in the summer of 1886. She left behind a daughter who was 2 years old." Jane looked at the fire. The child's father had already gone, walked away when Margaret took sick, which tells you everything you need to know about him. "I kept the little girl for 8 months while I worked and tried to find a permanent situation for us both." Henry was very still. "What happened to her?" he asked. "I found her a good home. A family in Wichita who had no children of their own and wanted one with everything in them. Good people, godly people." Jane's voice was even, held steady by long practice. "I have never stopped asking myself whether I was right, whether I gave her up too easily, or whether I did the only honest thing for her future." She looked at Henry. "I kept the photograph because she is the reason I answered your notice, because when I read the words, 'child in care,' I understood exactly what that meant and what it asked." The fire spoke. The wind moved in the pines. Henry set his book down on the table. "Jane," he said, and the way he said her name was different from any of the other times, quieter, more deliberate, as though he were setting something carefully down rather than speaking. "She is why I said what I said in the store," Jane said. "Not as a pretty speech. I meant it then and I mean it now. I will raise Clara as my own, whatever form this arrangement takes." Henry rose from his chair. He did not cross the room. He simply stood and looked at her and said, "I would like to change the arrangement." Jane waited. "I would like it to be a marriage," he said, "a real one, not a convenience." He paused, and a thing that was very nearly painful moved across his face, the look of a man making himself entirely vulnerable on purpose, which is a braver act by far than any physical courage. "I know I have no particular right to ask. I know it's only been 2 months, but Clara needs you to stay and He stopped. "Try it again. I need you to stay, not because of the ranch, not because of the water rights, because without you in this cabin, it is just walls and cold, and with you it is a home." Jane held his gaze for a long moment. Then she said, "There is one condition." "Name it." "Clara keeps her mother's name, Ruth. Whatever she calls me, whatever we are to each other, she keeps Ruth as her middle name, so she always knows." Henry's breath went out of him slowly, like a long-held thing finally released. "Yes," he said. "That was already what I wanted." Jane folded the mended shirt and set it on the table. She stood up. They were not far apart in the small cabin. The lamplight lay between them, warm as something alive. "Then yes," she said, "a real one." There was no fanfare, no grand gesture. He took her hand in both of his rough carpenter's hands and held it, and she felt the steadiness in him, the same steadiness that had built a cabin from the ground in a brutal winter, that had held a sick child through 14 months of grief, that had set a second chair at the table before she arrived. She felt it pass into her like warmth from a fire you have been standing near for some time without realizing how cold you were. They were married by the Reverend Aldous Cole at the Harland Creek Church on the 18th of December, a Saturday of pale winter sun and iron-cold air that smelled of pine and fresh snow. Clara stood between them in a dress Jane had made from two of her own good pieces, and when Reverend Cole reached the part about family and home, Clara reached up without ceremony and took one of Jane's fingers in her fist and held on. Henry saw. He looked at Jane over the top of Clara's head, and Jane saw in his gray eyes something she had not seen there before. Not trouble being controlled, not grief being carried, simply joy, plain and unguarded, like a light left on in a window. Reverend Cole pronounced them husband and wife. Clara let go of Jane's finger only long enough to clap her hands twice, then took it back. The storekeeper, whose name was Briggs, and who had listened to every word of that first meeting, hosted a small celebration that afternoon. He was, Jane had come to understand, a gossip of the highest order, but also a man of genuine goodwill, and those two things coexisted in him without much friction. He said to Jane, pulling her aside at the refreshment table, "I wasn't sure about you at first. You looked too practical." "Is that a fault?" Jane said. He thought about it. Not on the frontier, he admitted. The water rights dispute was resolved in February, when the territorial judge in Boise found that the creek in question had historically served multiple homesteads and could not be claimed as a private water right by any single party. Denton Holt's riders did not come again that spring. The south herd came through the winter intact. In March, Jane turned the kitchen garden, and Clara walked the rows beside her, naming things she intended to plant. Beans, she said, and some flowers, because her mama had always grown flowers, and flowers made a place look like it meant to stay. Jane gave her a packet of marigold seeds from her carpet bag. She had carried them from Abilene in the pocket beside the photograph. Clara planted them in a row along the garden's south edge, pressing each seed in with the seriousness of a person performing an important office. When the last seed was in, she looked up at Jane with earth on her hands and the pale spring sun on her face. "Will they come up?" she asked. "They will," Jane said. And in June they did. The photograph of Margaret Whitfield stayed in the Bible between the pages of the Gospel of John. Jane did not hide it, and she did not display it. It lived where important things live, kept close, brought out when needed, a reminder of the reason and the cost and the grace. When Clara was old enough to ask, Jane showed it to her and told her about Margaret and about the little girl in Wichita and about the summer of 1886. And Clara listened with the complete attention of a child who understands, even at her age, that stories of loss can also be stories of love. And so the photograph proved what it had always proved. Not a secret, not a sorrow held in hiding, but the simple and enormous truth that the woman who had come to Harland Creek in the mud and cold of October had been shaped, long before she arrived, into exactly the kind of mother a child like Clara needed. Now, friend, if you've stayed with Jane and Henry and little Clara through this whole journey, through the October mud and the December lamplight and the first row of marigolds, you already know what this story is really about. It's about the way we are sometimes prepared for the people we need long before we ever meet them. A grief you carry becomes a gift you give. A photograph you never let go of turns out to be the very thing that led you home. Have you ever held on to something from your past that ended up pointing you toward your future? Leave your answer in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. And if tales like these speak to your heart, please subscribe so you don't miss a single one of our Old West journeys. There are more waiting for you, full of hard winters and warm fires, and the quiet miracles that happen when good people find each other. Good night. God bless you and everyone you carry in your heart.